morning. I'm Karen Sands O'Connor. I'm the British Academy Global Professor at Newcastle University. And today I'm going to be talking about a teacher who published anthologies of children's writing. And it's a very complicated story when you have teachers publishing children's writing, because you wonder how much is the teacher and how much is the student. So I can't answer all the questions really about this particular teacher's interaction. There was certainly a lot of controversy about it. And so I wanted to delve into it a little bit and think about what might be the authentic child's voice and what might not be. Okay, so we'll get started here. Right. So between 1965 and 1985, British education activists focused on the idea of authentic children's voices. Some, like Lila Berg or the creators of the Breakthrough to Literacy series, used reading schemes to connect with children's language. Writing in Reading is an Act of Love, Berg argued that books had to welcome the child in. If the language, situation, characters, standpoint are utterly alien, and the child who reads gets no reflection of himself, why should anyone on earth read? Anyone at all? Berg focused on the working class child's experience, creating stories about betting shops, bomb sites, and Brixton Market, using informal language and humor. The Breakthrough series, edited by David McKay, Pamela Schaub, and Brian Thompson, which you see on the right, tried to use everyday situations to spark children's own storytelling. The books in this series were, according to the editors, based on conversations with 5-year-olds. These stories were written down verbatim, they argued, and subsequently rewritten so as to retain the essential quality of the originals while conforming broadly to the use of standard English. So you see that there was some mediation involved between the working class child's voice and the adult who was trying to use it as a teaching tool. And for younger readers, that connection to their experiences in language was important, but it definitely needed to be mediated. For the older reader, however, this connection to children's voices often came through their own writing, and their own writing being published as opposed to, as with the younger child, being mediated. This included contests, writers' groups, and classroom activities that led to publications of anthologies. While many of these were general, W.H. Smith, which you see on the left there, and the Daily Mirror had been running a competition for young writers since 1959, for example. Others were specific to the voices of young people from underrepresented British communities. Small community presses such as Centerprise and Hackney had begun publishing young writers in the early 1970s with surprising success. Black British teenager Vivian Usherwood's collection of poems, for example, published by Centerprise in 1972, sold over 6,500 copies in 5 years and led to the community center publishing more work from teenagers. Ken Warpole, who brought Usherwood's poems to Centerprise's attention, writes that Usherwood's poems were mostly about feeling rejected at school and in the children's home where he was in care. Warpole believed that access to books, both to be able to buy them easily and to be involved in producing them, we regard as a right and a way of belonging in society. But for some activists, like Chris Searle, publishing children's voices was not just about expression, but about action and human rights. As he wrote in None But Our Words, as words are the forerunners and prompters of action, then the teaching of words cannot be separated from encouragement to action. Like Lila Berg, Chris Searle was white, British, interested in education, and advocated for children's rights through his teaching and his writing about education. He and Berg did not agree about methods. Berg wanted to break down the system of compulsory state education to let children create their own learning, and complained that Searles' teaching is based, like the teaching of any Tory teacher at any state school, on different levels of coercion. And that's important, an important idea, because it will come back to haunt this paper, basically. Her concern arose from the fact that Searle did not leave children to do their own investigations, but directed their learning as he would have been required to do in any state school. Searle's response was that an understanding of our history, as long as it is our history, the history of ordinary people in this world and all its struggling communities, gives us a secure confidence that just as those who came before could act to make things better in conditions that were harder, more fraught, and challenging, then so can we now. Searle's ideas about education may not have been radical enough for Berg, but they were certainly too radical for the school governors where he worked in Stepney. Searle was fired from his teaching job in 1971 for embracing this history of the ordinary people and insisting on publishing his students' poetry that reflected those histories in an anthology called Stepney Words. The Board of Governors initially just complained that the poetry was negative and felt that poetry was something that should uplift its readers, but Searle and his students saw it as a voice for change. Indeed, valuing students' voices benefited Searle when he was sacked. His students subsequently went on strike, using their newfound political voices to demand Searle's reinstatement. Searle commented, "These governors did not want the children to write about the real world. As I said later, they wanted the Cockney sparrow to sing cheerfully from his cage." Stepney Words began as a project to get students out of this cage and into the local community. Searle was keen that they should be aware of the very place that Donne had worked as minister and at the end of the road where Isaac Rosenberg had lived and grown to poetry, as well as the churchyard where there were still the discernible mounds that signified the mass graves of the Great Plague of 1666. So he wanted them to see all of this as he took them out into the streets. He wanted them to see the poetry and the people who had created the area of London where they lived and feel like they belonged to something bigger. The emphasis on visioning the world around them means that Stepney Words actually has perhaps the greatest percentage of nature poetry out of all the anthologies that Searle produced. Louise Samuels, one of the young poets, wrote about an autumn morning in Stepney churchyard in which the dew that lay by the ever-laid leaves is fainting into the background to die. It's a very teenage poem, isn't it? But these poems are also about how nature affects poor people more than others. Samuels also writes a poem, and actually the first poem is from Stepney Words, the original that was published. The second is, you can see the different typeface, is from Fire Words, which was sort of the follow-up. They were later published as a single volume. Samuels also writes a poem about the wind, which comes right at you through the open door. The very real and often negative effects of their surrounding form a crucial part of the anthology, whether at school, home, or in the streets. Even though Searle felt stung by some of the students' criticism, he did not try to edit their ideas. The school's board of governors, however, felt more than stung. Searle writes, "The only negative opinions, unfortunately, came as we feared from the school governors. I was invited to one of their meetings where they said they thought the anthology was unbalanced, too gloomy, and couldn't I find some more cheerful poems to make it more positive?" Searle refused, and that's when he was sacked. Later, he was reinstated. Actually, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, oddly enough. Indeed, Searle's commitment to the student voices was so strong at this point that although it is clear he gave the student prompts, there are several poems in the anthology about the long and winding road, for example, responses no doubt to the Beatles tune, which had been released in May 1970. Stepney Words includes several poems that would run counter to Searle's own political views. And I think this is really very important. For example, Janet Sterney's My Old Flats focuses first on the rusted fire escape where the washing hangs before detailing her wish for a home with a door knocker that no one would touch because they thought it was too valuable. The house would have 2 swimming pools, of course, Olympic size. Writing in 2001, Searle argued that the British education system had taught children like Janet to think this way. They are instructed on how to live by a false morality, which gives greater significance to individual advancement and competitive social relations than it does to ways of making union, creating community esteem, and securing safe and generous futures for those who live now. Racism was also a part of state education, according to Searle. Under capitalism, the school is a Janus. It is this institution of a state which condones the exploitation of an entire class and promotes racism to divide its greatest enemy, which is that same class, for its own economic interest and survival. He did not blame the children for their attitudes or censor them in Stepney words. In order to eradicate racism, Searle thought, at least at this point, he believed that all working class voices needed to be heard, including that of the racist. Thus, on the same page, and I did try to make a slide of this, but it was too hard to read because the poems were too tiny print. Searle can publish a poem entitled Racial Harmony that doubts its possibility, commenting that illegal entries to this country from India and Pakistan disgust me. And another poem that suggests people should treat the immigrant like you treat your mother. Searle believed that allowing a child an unedited, a literally unadulterated voice would build a unity and comradeship, bridging the gulf of racism and allowing for a working class revolution. Searle's early books of young people's poetry were successful after a fashion. Stepney words received extensive media coverage, and although not all of it was favorable, much of it was. And even the negative publicity helped sell books. After the initial print run produced by Searle ran out, local community publisher Centerprise published the first two collections in a single volume in 1973, in addition that sold more than 5,500 copies. The book's success gained attention for some of the young people as well. The young illustrator for the second collection featured in a BBC documentary entitled Born to Fail in 1972, in which he attempted to remain an artist after having left school. Searle sees his stories as a success. He talks about it as a success, describing him as a teacher of art who has reached the goal that society had told him was unreachable. However, if you watch the program, it shows him only teaching members of his own family. So it's not clear how much of a teacher of art he became. The Times Literary Supplement praised Fire Words, the volume that followed Stepney Words, for the children's sense of social injustice, but also wonders how much of this is editorial policy. There is a lingering concern in many of the reviews that while the voices of the students were authentic, the benefit for them in having their voices expressed was minimal. This sense that Searle, as editor, was benefiting more than his students only increased over time. For Searle, the success of Stepney Words and the media attention it brought him emboldened him to do even more. His next anthology, Classrooms of Resistance, which came out in 1975, was less about the local area and more about the world in which the students lived. They showcase Searles' teaching methods, which, as he describes them, are about giving students the knowledge of resistance to an organization against exploitation and subjection, and contact and empathy with the oppressed of the world, whether in your own street or lands or oceans away. He tends to write in very complicated sentences. Focusing on current events, Searle taught the students about exploitation or violence, from the opening of a luxury hotel in their area when local residents were waiting to be rehoused, to the coup d'etat in Chile in 1973 that put Pinochet in power. He then had them write response pieces, sometimes poetry, sometimes essays, sometimes plays, that were anthologized in the book that you see here, Classrooms of Resistance. But the children's voices heard in Classrooms of Resistance are not the varied voices of Stepney Words. There are no National Front viewpoints in the section on South Africa or pining for swimming pools in the section on the Tower Hotel, the luxury hotel that was built in their area. Karen Marshall, age 13, writes in 6,000 Acres that if she had control of the 6,000 acres that were used for the Tower Hotel, I would not make hotels or silly things for businessmen that have money to throw away. I would make new houses with gardens, toilets, bathrooms, and all the other things you have. Andrew Redder, age 14, imagines himself a Black South African who witnesses the Carlsonville massacre in which 11 Black miners were shot during a strike for higher wages. Searle suggests that the sympathies and solidarity of the children went out in their writing directly to the oppressed, breaking through the false barriers of race and nationalism. That sounds good, doesn't it? Andrew's response is almost gleeful in its violence. While I was in jail, I had to blow up some of the boulders from the sides of the mountains. Now I blow up buildings. Once we blacks have overthrown the white men, we shall make them work on the same pay and conditions that we have had to bear with. There's a sense of vengeance in these poems, which Searle sees as solidarity. Other people were not so quick to believe that the children's voices were either authentic or understood what they were writing about. The right-wing columnist for the Daily Telegraph, Peter Simple, commented sarcastically that the working classrooms of resistance was all produced with stimulated spontaneity by these keen working class child students of world politics. He called for an end to the systematic indoctrination of our children. And John Isbicki, also in the Telegraph, argues that nowhere in classrooms of resistance is there the faintest ray of pleasure or the innocence of a child's humor. While the school governors had merely complained about the negative view of life produced by Searles students, the media was more concerned about condemnation of the police, the British Army in Ulster, apartheid, which is interesting that it was seen as an okay thing to like, and the rich in general. And that was from this article here, Get the Class Out of Classroom. The concern that Searle was teaching anti-authoritarianism was often couched in the idea that the students' voices were inauthentic or were authentically Searle's alone. Thus, it is instructive to look at the last anthology of student poetry, Our City, that Searle produced. By 1980, Searle had left the classroom altogether and was working for a new branch of the communist publisher Liberation that he had helped to set up with Kay Beecham. Initially, Young World produced stories from Africa and the Caribbean, primarily from regions where revolution and anti-imperial activities were taking place. Searle's earliest contribution for the press was Tales of Mozambique in 1980, which helped the press win recognition through the other award. Beecham notes that the book was sold out for 2 years until an order from the ILIA enabled us to reprint it. And the ILIA, for those of you who don't know, is the Inner London Education Authority. While Tales of Mozambique is about anti-racism and anti-imperialism in Africa, Searle would return to anti-racism in Britain with Young World in 1984, when in cooperation with the Greater London Council, Searle organized a competition for London school students to write poems on the theme of our city for the GLC's Year Against Racism. The poetry in Our City came from classrooms all across the capital and was judged by Searle, the sociologist and documentary filmmaker Colin Prescott, and the African writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Searle, in his preference, says that they received many hundreds of poems and have sought to publish a selection of the strongest sent us from many parts of London. Searle helped select the poems, but the child writers were not taught or indoctrinated, depending on who you were asking, by Searle. Yet the collection has many of the same themes as Stepney Words. Diane Conlon in Stepney Words describes Stepney as a stinking rotten hole. Richard Howard argued something similar about Hackney. Hackney is a very dirty borough. It is also a very lazy borough. Kelvin Samuel in Stepney Words wonders why we knock down houses and we build car parks. Why don't we build houses? Aisha Siddiqui similarly suggests in Our City, the housing in London is too crowded, too many people in one house, unfit to live in. Patton in Our City, both Gary Patton in Our City and Gary Matthews in Stepney Words view the docks as eerily empty. For Patton, they are a ghost town, and for Matthews, they are simply the ghostly docks. These similarities suggest that concerns about housing, dereliction, and unemployment are real rather than indoctrinated concerns. Fears of nuclear war appear in Our City, but not Stepney Words, further suggesting that these poems emerge from real concerns of children. And although neither book discusses dictators or politics in other countries, the collections differ politically in one important way. While both collections discuss racism, Our City points a finger in a direction that the child writers of Stepney Words had not, the police. Noreen Cuddy, for example, writes of people pulling a turban off a Sikh man. When the police arrived, to my disbelief, they arrested all 3 of the men, including the Sikh. The 1980s, with its racist sus laws, had increased the general sense through the capital that the police were not on the side of the ordinary people. And in pointing this out, Cuddy claims London as a city that belongs to these ordinary people, white, black, and brown. Searles' anthologies gave students a published voice and a place in the book world. He valued the views of the places and people in their lives. While he may have encouraged them to write about the problems associated with being poor in a wealthy country, a comparison of the poems written by his own students with ones from across London suggests that children, possibly from a variety of classes and certainly from a variety of areas of London, had similar concerns, concerns not always addressed by the literature they read. However, the media, the government, and the mainstream publishing industry at best ignored and at worst tried to censor these children's voices. Our city became part of the downfall of the Inner London Education Authority when, according to the Daily Mail, Lady Olga Maitland, the coordinator of a group called Schools Watch, called for our city and other books published by Young World to be withdrawn because they're an absolute disgrace. They are totally biased and undermine every aspect of authority. Young World's publications were part of the dangerous reading material brought up in Parliament as one of the reasons for abolishing the ILIA. In March 1988, Conservative MP for Battersea John Boas complained that Labour leader Neil Kinnock has been supporting books by the Marxist organization Liberation for use in London schools. With the abolition of the ILIA, children's voices, those published by Searle as well as other activists, including Len Garrison and Ansel Wong, were silenced. But I do want to end with this poem by Keith Adams, where it really is a sense of the child's voice. They live in a place where they have homeless people, they have riots, but it is their home. It is our city. So thank you very much.